The Tsar tank. Built by the Russian Empire during the First World War, this vehicle abandoned every conventional idea about what a tank should look like, using two enormous spoked wheels nearly 9 meters tall at the front, resembling something closer to an artillery cannon carriage than an armored fighting machine. Engineers believed the massive front wheels would allow it to roll over obstacles and trenches that smaller tracked vehicles could never cross. A much smaller pair of wheels supported the rear of the vehicle, creating an awkward, top-heavy silhouette unlike anything else built for combat. During its only field test in 1915, the rear wheel sank immediately into soft ground and became permanently stuck, unable to generate enough power to pull itself free. Project was abandoned where it sat, and the massive frame remained rusting in a forest for years afterward, before eventually being scrapped. What makes this vehicle memorable is how directly its greatest ambition, towering over any obstacle in its path, became the exact flaw that left it helplessly immobile on its first real test. The Char 2C. Developed by France near the end of the First World War, though completed only after the fighting ended, this tank became the heaviest ever put into operational service, weighing significantly more than double the tanks fielded by other nations at the time. Its enormous size required an entire crew of up to 12 men to operate, far more than any comparable vehicle, including dedicated positions for driving, gunnery, and even a radio operator. Two separate engines were needed just to move its massive frame, and transporting it between locations required a specially built railway car, since ordinary roads and bridges struggled to support its weight. Despite its imposing scale, the tank saw almost no real combat use, spending most of its service life as a propaganda symbol meant to demonstrate French industrial and military strength between the wars. When German forces invaded France in 1940, several of these tanks were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, unable to be moved quickly enough to escape the advancing front. What set this tank apart was less its usefulness and more its sheer physical presence, a rolling fortress built more to impress than to fight. The Ratto. Conceived by Nazi Germany during the later years of the Second World War, this design existed only on paper. Yet its scale still stands out as one of the most extreme tank concepts ever seriously proposed. Engineers envisioned a vehicle weighing over 1,000 tons, roughly 20 times heavier than a standard battle tank of the era, armed with naval-grade cannons typically mounted on warships rather than land vehicles. Its designers imagined it functioning almost like a mobile fortress, capable of crushing smaller vehicles and buildings simply by driving over them. Military officials who reviewed the proposal quickly recognized fundamental problems, since no bridge could support its weight, no road could bear its pressure without collapsing, and its massive silhouette would make it an easy target for aircraft. Adolf Hitler personally showed interest in the concept, but practical objections from military engineers eventually killed the project before any prototype construction began. What makes this design notable is that it represents the furthest edge of tank ambition taken to its logical extreme. A vehicle so large that it stopped making sense as a weapon and became closer to a mobile building. The Tog 2. Designed by Britain early in the Second World War, this tank was built by engineers who had personally lived through the trench warfare of the previous global conflict, and its shape reflected that outdated experience directly. Convinced that the new war would again bog down into static trench battles, designers created an extremely long, low vehicle intended to cross wide trenches the way tanks had decades earlier. By the time it was completed, however, the nature of warfare had shifted dramatically toward fast, mobile tank battles across open ground, making its trench crossing design almost entirely irrelevant to the fighting actually taking place. Its slow speed and awkward proportions made it a poor match against the more maneuverable tanks fielded by opposing forces. Only a small number were ever built, and none saw meaningful combat service, serving instead as a testing platform for newer components before being retired. What makes this tank distinctive is how clearly it demonstrates the risk of designing for the last war rather than the next one. A vehicle built to solve a problem that had already stopped existing. The Panzer VIII Maus. Developed by Germany during the final years of the Second World War, this tank became the heaviest fully operational armored vehicle ever built, weighing more than double most heavy tanks fielded by any nation during the conflict. Its armor was thick enough to resist almost any anti-tank weapon in use at the time. But that same protection came at the cost of extreme weight, limiting its top speed to barely faster than a walking pace. Most bridges could not support its mass, forcing engineers to design it with the ability to ford rivers by driving completely submerged along the riverbed while a crew member breathed through a connected air tube. Fuel consumption proved so extreme that maintaining any reasonable operational range became a persistent challenge throughout testing. Only a small handful of prototypes were completed before the war ended, and the remaining vehicles were captured by Soviet forces, who studied the design before eventually scrapping most of it. What makes this tank remarkable is the tension built directly into its design. Armor thick enough to survive nearly anything, paired with mobility barely sufficient to move at all. The flying tank Antonov A-40, developed by the Soviet Union just before the Second World War, this project attempted something no other nation seriously pursued: attaching a detachable glider frame directly onto a light tank in hopes of delivering armored vehicles behind enemy lines by air rather than by road. Engineers removed unnecessary weight from a standard light tank and fitted large fabric-covered wings and a tail section onto its frame, intending for a larger aircraft to tow the combined glider tank into the air before releasing it to land near the battlefield. During its only known test flight in 1940, the combined weight created so much drag that the towing aircraft could not maintain sufficient speed, forcing an early release that still allowed the tank to glide down and land successfully, with the crew reportedly driving it away afterward. Despite this partial success, military planners realized that any tank light enough to fly would be too weak in armor and firepower to survive real combat conditions. The program was quietly canceled soon after, considered an interesting experiment rather than a practical weapon. What makes this vehicle stand out is the sheer strangeness of the concept itself. A tank that briefly became an aircraft purely to solve a transportation problem no other engineers had approached from the sky. The Object 279. Built by the Soviet Union during the Cold War, this experimental tank was designed with an almost saucer-shaped hull specifically intended to survive a nuclear battlefield, where blast waves and shock waves posed as much danger as conventional enemy fire. Its unusual four-track configuration, with a separate track assembly at each corner of the vehicle, was meant to distribute weight evenly across soft or irradiated ground where a standard two-track tank might become stuck or flipped by a nearby explosion. Engineers shaped the hull to deflect blast pressure the way an aircraft wing deflects airflow, reducing the chance that a shockwave could tip the vehicle over entirely. Only a small number of prototypes were ever built, and the design was ultimately judged too complex and expensive for mass production compared to more conventional heavy tanks in development at the same time. It never saw combat and was eventually retired to a museum collection, remembered more as an engineering curiosity than a fielded weapon. What makes this tank unusual is how directly its bizarre shape traces back to a very specific, very unusual battlefield threat that most other tank designers never had to seriously consider. The cruiser tank Challenger. Among the earliest and strangest battlefield improvisations, some of the very first tanks deployed during the First World War were modified in the field to project streams of burning fuel at entrenched enemy positions, turning armored vehicles designed for breaking through barbed wire into mobile incendiary weapons. Crews rigged pressurized fuel tanks and ignition systems onto existing armored hulls, creating a terrifying, close-range weapon that combined the psychological horror of fire with the protection of armor plating. These improvised designs were extremely dangerous to their own crews since the fuel tank sat exposed near the vehicle's exterior, vulnerable to enemy fire that could turn the tank itself into an explosion. Reliability proved inconsistent, with flame projection systems frequently failing or malfunctioning under the harsh conditions of trench warfare. Despite their crude construction, these early experiments laid the groundwork for the more refined flamethrower tanks that several nations would develop and formally adopt decades later during the Second World War. What makes these early vehicles notable is their raw improvisation, built not from careful engineering but from battlefield desperation, turning an already frightening new weapon into something even more unsettling on the front lines.